Okay, so let's get into the source material you've pulled together for this deep dive. We're tackling, well, one of the really big questions, aren't we? Why do some places make it to democracy and stay there, while others just seem stuck, under autocratic regimes?
It's definitely a huge question and feels so relevant right now. And this material, it offers a really interesting angle. It's basically arguing it's not just about the usual suspects, politics, economics. It suggests our own psychology, our brains even, play this massive role in making authoritarianism stick around.
Right. That idea is quite startling, that our own thinking might actually work against democracy sometimes.
Right.
And your main source here, this paper by Dr. Kuchkarov and ChatGPT, it really digs into this using cognitive science, anthropology,
Yeah.
all sorts of fields.
Exactly. And it weaves in ideas from other major thinkers, too, like Guriev and Treisman's informational autocracy concept and Acemoglu and Robinson on extractive institutions. It connects a lot of dots.
Okay. So the mission for us today, for this deep dive, is really to unpack those, let's say, cognitive levers, the psychological buttons that autocrats seem to push so effectively to maintain power. It's like finding the hidden wiring.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And you listening might find some surprising links, really, between how your own brain tends to work and why submission can sometimes feel almost natural, maybe, or at least the easier path for humans.
So let's jump straight to that first big insight from the sources. This idea that our brains, they might actually be wired against the kind of constant critical thinking that democracy really needs, because thinking is just hard work, energetically speaking.
That's pretty much it, yeah. The source points out, the brain is this incredible energy hog. You mentioned Rachel and Guznard's work. It shows about 20% of your body's total energy budget goes just to running your brain, even though it's, only 2% of your body weight?
Wow, 20%.
Yeah.
Just keeping the lights on up there. And the sources say that actual thinking, like complex analysis, figuring things out for yourself, that costs even more.
It absolutely does. And this leads to, a fundamental cognitive bias, building on folks like Kahneman. Our brains evolved to find ways to save that energy. We lean on shortcuts, heuristics, prepackaged ideas. The source actually calls it cognitive laziness. It's not really lazy, it's efficient.
Okay, efficiency. The brain likes the easy route. So how does that play into an autocrat's hands?
Well, that's the clever part, isn't it? Simple, ready-made narratives, think slogans, really basic ideas like we're the best or everyone's against us or the leader knows all. These take almost no mental energy to just accept. They're just much, much easier than wrestling with complicated truths or, conflicting reports.
And I guess in those kinds of societies, thinking for yourself isn't just mentally tiring. It can be actively dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Socially or even physically risky.
Precisely. So conformity starts to look like the smart option. It's the path of least resistance, mentally and physically. You accept the dominant story, you conserve energy, and you stay out of trouble. These regimes get really good at exploiting this basic preference for cognitive ease. They feed you the simple stuff, the emotional stuff, making critical thinking seem not just hard, but actually perilous. Passive agreement gets rewarded.
Okay, so that's partly about saving brain energy now. But your sources also suggest these obedience patterns. They start much, much earlier, like laid down in childhood.
Yeah, this shifts the focus to our very early social conditioning. I mean, think about it. A child is completely dependent on caregivers, biologically. And that relationship, it swings between nurture and care and discipline or control. So very early on, we build this deep association. The authority figure, even a strict one, is also the source of safety, of protection.
Ah, so that really intense early bond. It kind of creates a blueprint in our heads.
It seems like it does. The source calls it a deep-seated obedience reflex.
Hmm.
We basically internalize these beliefs without even realizing it. Authority figures probably know best. Questioning them feels wrong somehow, or dangerous. And the big one, submission brings security, stability.
And autocrats must just look at that deep psychological pattern and think, great, I can work with that.
Oh, absolutely. They deliberately position themselves as that ultimate authority,
Yeah.
the father of the nation, the protector of the people. And then any dissent isn't just disagreeing with policy, it's framed as betrayal, like betraying your family. Loyalty becomes this huge virtue, tapping right into that ingrained psychological wiring that was set long before politics even entered the picture.
That reminds me of some of the broader cultural research, like Hofstede's work on power distance.
Exactly. High-power distance cultures, societies where respecting hierarchy is just deeply embedded, culturally expected. They're naturally more, let's say, fertile ground for leaders who want to exploit that obedience reflex we were just talking about. The predisposition is already there.
So, yeah, it's really clear it's moved beyond just, overt force, tanks in the streets kind of thing. Your sources are saying modern authoritarians are much more sophisticated now. They're like mind hackers
Sure.
using psychology.
That's the essence of Guriev and Treisman's informational autocracy. Power isn't just about coercion anymore, though that's still there, of course. It's heavily reliant on managing what people believe, shaping public perception. It's almost like large-scale psychological manipulation.
So what are some of the specific tools, the psychological techniques they use, according to the source?
Well, several key ones. First, that simplistic, repetitive messaging we talked about. The brain's love for easy answers makes propaganda, especially repeated propaganda, incredibly effective. The source lists examples like, "We are the greatest nation, enemies surround us, the leader is wise and infallible." Just hammer these home through controlled media until they feel like common sense.
In fear. Fear keeps coming up, doesn't it?
Oh, it's fundamental. And it links right back to that childhood conditioning, the strict parent equals safety idea. Autocrats constantly play up threats, real or imagined external enemies, internal saboteurs to make people feel insecure. That insecurity makes them crave strong leadership, makes them more willing to accept repression in exchange for perceived safety.
So they basically sidestep rational argument altogether.
Pretty much, yeah. It's less about convincing through logic and more about emotional manipulation, stirring up intense feelings, patriotism, nationalist pride, dredging up old historical grievances, pointing fingers at scapegoats, anything to keep emotions like fear, anger, or even fervent loyalty running high. Because when we're in that emotional state, our critical thinking faculties tend to, well, they take a backseat.
And this isn't just aimed at individuals one by one, right? It's about creating a collective conformity.
Absolutely. It's not enough for individuals to obey. The system needs collective submission. And conformity is key here. You remember those classic Solomon Asch experiments from the 50s? The line judgment tests?
Oh, yeah, where people would agree with a group's obviously wrong answer just to fit in? It's startling.
It really is. And regimes weaponize that impulse. How? Well, first, they try to eliminate any alternative viewpoints. If the only story you ever hear is the state's story, repeated everywhere, you naturally assume everyone else believes it too. That makes it incredibly hard psychologically to hold a dissenting view.
Which then encourages self-censorship, right? If you think you're the only one doubting, you're probably going to keep quiet. Which just reinforces the silence and the illusion that everyone's on board.
Exactly. And add to that, fostering social surveillance. Sometimes it's official informants. Sometimes it's just encouraging neighbors to watch each other. When you feel like you might be watched, you start policing your own words, your own thoughts even. It creates this pervasive atmosphere of compliance driven by social pressure.
The source also mentions propaganda as, like, mass brainwashing and draws on models like Herman and Chomsky's.
Yes, it fits that model. It's about that relentless repetition of simple emotional messages via state-controlled media. A classic tactic is always having an external enemy, the decadent West, or some internal other. It gives people something to blame, directs frustration outwards away from the regime, and underpinning it all is the constant effort to build up the leader's image, make them seem almost superhuman, the indispensable protector.
And it's not just the government's direct channels. They pull in other institutions, too, like religion or culture.
Oh, definitely. That's crucial. They co-opt religious leaders who then preach that submission is a religious duty. They amplify cultural traditions that value hierarchy and obedience over individual expression. And they push these deterministic narratives, this is just how things are. It's our destiny. Change is impossible or dangerous. It all works to dampen people's desire for anything different.
Wow. So when you stack all that up, the cognitive shortcuts, the childhood patterns, the deliberate psychological manipulation, the engineered conformity, the co-opted institutions, it really paints a picture of why these regimes aren't just fragile structures waiting to fall. They're deeply rooted.
They really are. And this connects to Acemoglu and Robinson's idea about extractive versus inclusive institutions. Autocracies build these extractive systems where power and wealth are funneled to a small elite. That elite then has a massive vested interest in keeping things exactly the way they are. It makes change from within incredibly hard because the people with power don't want it.
And plus, there's just a basic human resistance to change itself, isn't there? A psychological inertia.
For sure. Tversky and Kahneman called it the status quo bias. We tend to prefer the familiar, even if it's bad, over the uncertainty of something new. So even if life under authoritarianism is tough, the devil you know, it feels safer than the unknown alternative.
And the regime actively plays on that fear of the unknown, right? By painting any alternative as terrible.
Constantly. They spend a lot of energy discrediting democracy or any kind of reform. They'll portray it as chaotic, look at those unstable countries, or inherently corrupt, Western democracy is fake, or weak, only our strong leader can protect us. They work overtime to make the alternative seem terrifying, reinforcing that natural human tendency to stick with what's familiar.
So, okay, with all these forces, psychological, institutional, seemingly stacked against change, how do things ever shift? How does that cycle get broken?
Well, the source does acknowledge that, big revolutions happen sometimes, but it also suggests that sustainable change often comes through more gradual evolutionary processes within institutions.
And what are the key things that help drive that kind of gradual change, according to your sources?
Several things stand out. Education is huge, specifically. Education that fosters critical thinking, not just rote learning. That's obviously something autocrats try to suppress, but it's vital for people to start questioning the narratives. Independent media is another big one. Just having access to information outside the state's control, it starts to chip away at the official story, even if slowly.
And economics plays a role, too.
Yes, economic diversification seems important. If the economy isn't totally dependent on resources controlled by the ruling elite, if there are other sources of wealth and power emerging, it can sometimes lessen the elite's resistance to change. They might see less to lose, maybe even something to gain from a more open system.
What about connections to the outside world?
Yeah, international engagement seems to matter. Things like cultural exchange, trade ties, even just the internet allowing exposure to different ideas from more open societies. It can provide alternative models, create new aspirations, and subtly shift norms over time, bypassing some of the state's control.
Okay, so the main takeaway here seems to be that even though autocratic stability looks solid, it's not actually invincible.
Right. It relies heavily on this manufactured public complicity, which, as we've seen, is built by exploiting very basic human psychology, our desire for ease, for security, for fitting in. But that complicity isn't set in stone. It can be eroded by things like education, information, economic changes, and that erosion is often what paves the way for real systemic change down the line.
So wrapping up this deep dive into these sources, it's clear that despotic regimes aren't just about brute force. They lean heavily on understanding and manipulating fundamental human traits, our mental shortcuts, our early conditioning, our psychological biases, and, our powerful need to belong to the group.
Exactly. And understanding these deeper psychological and cognitive roots is just crucial, I think, if we want to really get why these systems can be so incredibly resilient, why they persist even when they seem to be failing their people in so many ways.
Yeah, this deep dive really highlights how deep those roots of submission can go, tapping into things that are part of all of us, really.
It definitely makes you appreciate the sheer power of these psychological factors in shaping entire societies. It's quite profound.
So maybe a final thought for you listening, based on this deep dive. Think about how these same mechanisms we've explored, the preference for easy answers, the fear of change, the pull of the crowd, how might they be subtly influencing your own thinking or playing out in other parts of the society you live in, even outside of, obviously, authoritarian systems? What does knowing about these hidden currents challenge you to see differently in your own life and the world around you?